Okay, everybody, thank you and welcome to our August webinar. My name is Dr. T. Wu. As I mentioned, our normal presenter for today's topic is running slightly behind schedule and she should be joining any minute. But without waiting, I will get started and I will talk about the theme of today's presentation. Agile, it is not just for IT. I'm sure many of you have been hearing about the world of Agile. And since about 2000, Agile has increased its popularity from a more of a, and today in some industry, especially software development, information technology, Agile is actually the mainstream. Just as a quick note on Zoom, feel free to use chat to address any questions you have. And at a logical moment, we will go back to questions. Right now, everybody's on mute. I believe you also have the capability of unmuting yourself. So if you want, you could also unmute yourself and ask questions, especially at the end. But please do remute yourself. If it gets too noisy, then we'll just mute everybody. So today, what is Agile? What is Agile Manifesto? And what are some of the Agile projects, comparing traditional to Agile, and talk about where Agile can be applied very successfully from non-IT projects. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the PMI-ACP certification and how to apply for that. So that's today's topic. You should take 1 hour, and hence this presentation, this webinar does earn you 1 PDU. So let's first talk about the presenter, and I'll introduce her. Her name is Susan Parente, and you could see the number of certification she has. She has been working with PMO Advisory for many years now, 15 years of experience as instructor and consultant in project management. She also has been developing a lot of the PMO. She has 20 years of engineering software development experience, and I should also that she's also a college professor. Working at Montclair State University, post-university, as an adjunct professor. A little bit about myself. I am a stand-in, hopefully for the next couple of minutes. My name is Dr. T. Wu, and founder of PMO Advisory. We are a specialty project management training and consulting firm. And I say because I consider us 1 inch wide, called project management, but a foot deep, because we're very, very much into the various aspects of project management, as you can see here. Agile, program management, portfolio, PMO, business execution, organization change. And we help organizations with as well as consulting. Think of us as a very strong firm in this arena called project management. Let's look at what is Agile. People think of Agile as a particular methodology or a set of tools. But more foundationally speaking, Agile is actually more of a principle. So in some ways, it's actually wrong to say I'm working with Agile method, because Agile itself is not a method. Principles of how business and projects truly work. These are the principles that guides the team, that guides the development of the project. And for many organizations, a set of techniques just readily bring to the organization and apply it. Give you a very simple example. Say your organization, especially if you're working a more hierarchical organization, takes roughly a week to make any big decisions. Okay, and you could treat whatever that big is. Take Scrum, for example. Scrum have a 4-week sprint. Decisions most likely should be made in the same day or very, very quickly, a day or two. As a cultural shift, demonstrate the problem with that organization implementing just Agile. Because if it takes a week to make a decision, not a lot. Agility, if you only have a 4-week sprint, and a lot of the Scrum sprints are shorter, then obviously taking a quarter of the time just to make one decision can be an issue. So that's a part of the cultural shift. Now, by the way, Ms. Susan Parente is back. I'd like to turn over to Susan for the rest of the presentation. Susan, can you jump in?
Sure, absolutely. So thank you so much, T. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure what you told them, but I had kind of a family emergency thing, and anyway, I'm glad T got started. He's definitely an expert in many arenas, and so I appreciate that in doing that. So, you know, the biggest thing I hear with what is Agile, a lot of people say, what's the difference between Agile and Scrum? You know, so that's kind of like one of the reasons I like to say upfront, what is Agile? So, you know, Scrum is one of the Agile methods. There's a number of different methods, but the other thing is I hear people say, oh, we're doing Agile. I'm like, that's great. What method are you using? They're like, huh? So, you know, really the idea here is that Agile is an approach. So I don't know if there's, I think you'll have to go to the next slide, because I don't think I can do that. Are you there, T?
Yes, I'm here. It's on the next slide.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so then what is not Agile? You know, it's basically, it's not a solution to all the problems you have. So it's not the easy button that a lot of times people want to think that it is or hope that it is. It's a toolbox of different methodologies that you can use. That does not mean you use them at, you know, just randomly. You want to have some sense to it, and usually you pick one of the methodologies, but you might also have a hybrid approach where you use more than one methodology. It's not a replacement for traditional project management processes, which means that just because you can use an Agile approach doesn't mean that you no longer need a traditional approach. You really want to look at it as a tool in your toolkit, which is why I have that toolbox there in the bottom right. So it's a tool. So there are some times where Agile is a good solution. There's sometimes where traditional project management is a good solution. And so it's not a replacement. So don't look at it as a one-on-one replacement. It's also not one specific method. As I mentioned, there are a number of different Agile methods. It's also not a reason to not collect requirements or understand customer needs. On the contrary, it's more of a need for you to do that. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues was working on a project that was using an Agile approach, and somebody said, oh, well, we don't need to collect requirements. We don't need to, well, not that we don't need to collect the requirements. They said, we don't have any requirements. It's the beginning of the project. They said, we don't need requirements because it's an Agile project. And she said, well, what do I say to them? And I said, well, go back to them and tell them you're done. And she's like, well, I don't understand. And say, well, I'm done. And if they say, well, how could you be done? Then you say, well, show me a requirement that you have for this system that my system doesn't meet. You know, so it's kind of like, you know, what you're creating, the product, service, or result that you're creating is coming from something. There's some requirements, there's some need for something. So what it means is you can gather requirements throughout the project. That's great, but it's not a reason to not collect requirements. And it's also not a way to do projects without following processes. Absolutely not. So each method has their own set of processes. And if you look at the Scrum method, which is the most commonly used Agile method, you'll see that there's some structure to that, and you can't just willy-nilly do things. So thinking that you're out of the process situation, you don't have to follow processes, you can do whatever you want, is definitely not the case. So next slide, please. And thank you so much, T. So why would we use Agile? So Agile practices and principles are used to manage change. So the number one reason we would want to apply an Agile approach is because we have a project where there's a high level of scope uncertainty, or a high risk, so uncertainty and risk being the same thing, basically, a high risk of the scope changing throughout the project. So an Agile approach is going to allow us to manage that change much better. And the way that it does that is we can constantly get changes, can constantly get new requirements throughout the time that we're doing the project. It doesn't just have to be at the beginning. It's also used to improve communication. So there's a big push for transparency and everybody being on the same page, and you know, being highly communicative with each other. Unfortunately, in traditional project management, oftentimes the customer asks for something in the beginning. We go off and do whatever we do, development, we do the work, and then we come back and show it to the customer. There's a lack of communication during that development often. So in Agile, we have more transparency and we're more working with that customer on a regular basis. Reducing cost. The biggest reason for that is the risk we have with changing scope. So because we're managing the risk of changing scope, we're also keeping our costs down because the cost of making a change later is greater. So increased efficiency, we're actually constantly going to look to inspect and adapt the work that we're doing. So it's about continuous improvement. It's a major part of using an Agile approach. And the other focus is providing value to customers and stakeholders. In fact, when I see the word Agile, the word that comes to mind is value. And if you haven't thought of that before, you might consider making that shift yourself, that when you see the word Agile, think value, because value is everywhere. It's how we prioritize. It's why we do the work we do. It's why we engage with the customer regularly, because it's all about creating value for our customer. And if we're not creating value, then we shouldn't be doing it. So that's a big part of it. And then, of course, decreasing project risk, which goes along with everything I've said here. So next slide, please. So when should we consider to use Agile? Well, when one or more of the following conditions is present, then it might make sense to use an Agile approach. So we have uncertainty, particularly in the area of requirements or changing conditions or scope that can change, or any type of environment where things are a little more tumultuous for whatever reason. That's would be a good reason to use Agile. Next, complexity. If our project has a high level of complexity, either in the content or the integration, like perhaps the product, service, or result for this project is integrated into some other product, service, or result. And so because of that, there's an increased complexity. We can also have complexity in regards to stakeholder management. We can have complex stakeholders because of where they're located or what departments they're from, things like that. Our solution for our product, service, or result could have a high level of complexity also. So again, if one or more of these conditions are present, an Agile approach would be a good idea. Next, we have innovation. Innovation you can think of as like opposite side of the coin of risk, like in a way that they're attached together, not really opposite of each other, but when we take on a project that has a high level of innovation, there's a high level of uncertainty or risk. So this would be new technologies, the content or the system itself. And this is why oftentimes people think of Agile as being used for software development, because there is a lot of innovation in the software development industry. However, Agile is in a lot of industries. I personally use it myself to develop training. So training material or new course development, both for professional courses and also university courses. I've used an Agile approach for that. I've used it for, a colleague of mine used it in the marketing arena. I'm working with somebody right now. We're using it in the marketing arena. I'm working on a project with a colleague of mine. Where else? I've seen it used in sales. So I mentioned education. Where are other innovative ideas? Even seeing it now in certain parts of construction, believe it or not. I teach a university class, actually at University of Virginia, and I teach an Agile class, and a lot of students come into that class in different industries. Some of them like in research and development, like science research and development, and they're starting to use Agile for those types of projects. Again, in construction and in that arena. Utilities. One of my students was actually in, I think it was an electrical utility company that they work for, and they were using Agile practices. So it's definitely not just software development. And although it may not be something you use for every project in your organization, you may use it for certain projects. And so that's where you want to look at that. And then also urgency. So urgency, anytime that you have a project that has a high priority or a short timeline. So the reason for that is because we're developing incrementally, we can actually deliver features or functions and in part. So we can deliver 1 or 2 features or functions after each iteration, and that customer, those stakeholders for that project, can immediately get value. So they don't need to wait so long. So if I have a year-long project and there's a high level of priority or a short timeline, I can actually start to deliver parts of that very early on. Whereas with traditional project management, the customer would have to wait till the end of 12 months. So I'll give you an example of that. If I was developing an online course that was an 8-week course, I could start to develop that course, develop week 1, and deliver it while working on week 2. So instead of waiting, let's say each week takes me a week to develop. So instead of waiting 2 months for students to actually use the course, I could actually do, high level planning development, but then do the detailed development for each week of the course. I could actually deliver it a week at a time. And as long as I'm a week ahead of my students, or maybe even 2 weeks ahead of my students might be nicer, but I could actually work on that course as the students are in it. So that shows you like a huge difference. So if I'm normally taking 8 weeks to develop that course and deliver it, and now I only have to take 2, and I can start to deliver it while I'm working on it. So that shows you how you can use Agile to address urgency. So next slide. Okay, so the Agile Manifesto, I tweaked it a little bit here because we're talking here about how Agile is not just for IT. What the Agile Manifesto says, and you can see the reference at the bottom, www.agilemanifesto.org, you can actually go there and see it. It says we're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we've come to value, and it lists these 4 values here. And what they're saying is these things on the left, we value them over the things on the right. Not that the things on the right are not important, but we value the things on the left more. So what this says is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So if you've ever worked on a team where somebody is, upset because you didn't follow the process, even though what you were doing was the right thing for the customer, the right thing for the stakeholder, and it really considered them and valued them or valued your team member, even if it wasn't following the process and the tools, in Agile, they would say that is the right thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore all processes, but you might want to inspect those processes and adapt them. Because if the processes are not working in favor of people and creating value, then that wouldn't work very well. And you see where I tweaked it here. So in the Agile Manifesto, it says working software over comprehensive documentation, but we're saying working product. And the reason I'm saying working product is because this isn't just for IT. It isn't just for software development. And what we're saying is we care about documentation where it's needed, but comprehensive documentation without a working product doesn't create value for a customer. So you see that value comes up here again. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. The way that I look at this is when I start working on a project, I think of it as we're all on the boat together. So I've got my customer, myself leading the project. If I've got subcontractors or other vendors, I just say, you know what? We all came from wherever we came from, but we're all on this boat together, and we're either going to sink or swim, or sink or float, I guess, in that case. And so what that's saying is, okay, we have contracts, but let's not be so focused on the contract that we're not meeting our customer's need and we're not adding value for our customer. Let's really look at it as we're in this together, and our customer success is our success. And there's no way for us to be successful if our customer isn't, and our customer can't be successful if we're not. So we need to really work together. Responding to change over following a plan. So what that means is that at any given moment, if there's a change needed, if the business requires a change because of the value that means for them, then we need to follow we need to respond to that change before we follow the plan. So in traditional project management, we have a plan, we stick to the plan unless we issue a change request. But here, we're always focused on responding to the change because we know that that change is what's adding value for that product. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so what does Agile entail? There's some different characteristics for Agile projects, and a lot of times, like I said, people think Agile is just Scrum. But if you've ever worked on a project where there is iterative development, incremental development, or where there's time boxing used. So what time boxing means is that if I have planned to work on a particular feature and be done by Friday, and Friday comes and I'm not done on a traditional project, I'm working Saturday and Sunday and working overtime and getting it done, and I'm not moving to the next step until I'm done. And the reason for that is because we're very plan-driven in traditional project management, and we're delivering on a committed to scope. In Agile, we're value-driven, and our schedule is put in place, so we have a time frame, and that's our time box for that iteration. We get to the end of the iteration, if we haven't finished something, we stop anyway. We take the thing we haven't done and we reprioritize that. That's really valuable because we may find, even though we're focused on finishing something that we've been working on, there may now be other things that are more important than even finishing that thing that, even if we're 95% done with. Okay, very quickly, the difference between iterative and incremental. Incremental is for, like I gave with that example, the 8-week class. I'm delivering the class in 1-week increments or units or modules. And iterative, with iterative, I'm creating something and then I'm getting feedback and then I'm making changes to it. So I always think of, you know, the cup that somebody uses maybe for coffee, and then they say, oh, I want to insulate it, and so you add insulation, and then you show them that and they say, oh, that's great, but I want a handle and I want a lid. And so it's more like a prototyping kind of way of doing things. So you iterate, and with each iteration you get closer to the end product result that the customer wants. So Agile requires trust, commitment, and flexibility. It also requires us understanding business priorities, and it has a significant stakeholder engagement. And this is one of those things that seems really great. The customer's going to be involved. This is wonderful that they're going to be involved. But then what we find is that actually a lot of times when Agile is being implemented, sometimes those customers are not available. They're not used to being interacted with regularly. They want to give you the requirements and say, go off and work on it and get back to us later. And with Agile, there's regular interaction with that customer. And so that significant stakeholder engagement is a really key part of having an effective Agile project where you're able to deliver value to your customer. And so if you have a situation where the customer is not so available, that could be a reason why Agile doesn't work. And an example of that is in the Scrum method. If you don't have a designated product owner who's involved, they're the customer representative who basically prioritizes all of the requirements and what's needed. If they're not highly involved, you're not going to be so likely to be successful. So that's something to look at. So next slide. So this is a high-level comparison of traditional and Agile approach. So in traditional, we have this project management plan. In Agile, we do planning. A lot of times people say we don't do any planning. We do planning, but we do it incrementally. So we do this little piece of planning. So if I have that 8-week project, I'm not planning for the 8-week project. I'm planning for the 1 week at a time or 2 weeks at a time. That's what we mean. And so it's almost like the incremental planning. It's like a little project. It's like a 2-week iteration becomes a 2-week project. It has initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So it's kind of just packed into this really mini project. So we do planning in Agile, but it's incremental. Traditional has regular status meetings, and we include things like the issue log and the risk register. In Agile, we have more transparent daily reporting. We usually see something like a task board or burn down charts. And we have these in something called an information radiator. I'm working on a project right now with one of my colleagues, and we're actually using Trello. And Trello is a free product. I love it. It's great. And if you have questions about it, you can email me at the end of the webinar. I can share with what I know. So what's great is Trello is basically a task board. So I'm able to work on this project with colleagues of mine who live hours away, and we're all virtual now anyway. Even if I could drive there, I wouldn't, right? So we have this task board, and it's basically our information radiator. And we were talking just this morning about some things that we're doing, and my one colleague said, "Oh, I gotta go put that on the Trello board so we have it, so we all have access to it all the time." So that's what we mean by transparent daily reporting. So in traditional, we have teams that are managed by the project manager, and Agile teams are managing themselves. So, you know, they're self-organized. That doesn't mean they get to decide what's the priority of things they're doing, but they do get to decide how they complete that work. Okay, so that's a good distinction. Traditional, we have facilitation of meetings. The project manager or some other person facilitates meetings. In Agile, we also have meetings. We have some different meetings, like usually a daily meeting, a planning for each iteration. How often we have those depends how often our iterations are. And we have a retrospective or an iteration review, where we actually look at what we did in that iteration, what went well, what didn't, and go from there. Next, we have deliverables. Deliverables in traditional project management, they're reviewed and approved, and often most of the deliverables come at the end of the project. In Agile, our deliverables are more frequent, and we focus on providing value to the customer as often as possible. And ideally, we want to deliver something to them at the end of each iteration. Whether that actually goes into production or not is something different, but we want to create something valuable at the end of each iteration when we're using an Agile approach. And next slide, please. Okay, so project constraints. This might be a little bit of a review for you. This is called the triple constraint, scope, cost, and time. I also show quality in the middle. Quality is customer satisfaction. And if we increase the scope for a project, what the triple constraint says, if we increase the scope for the project, we must change either the cost or the time. So you have to give ourselves more time, more money, or maybe both, okay? So if we don't do that, so this is sort of like looking at the negative side, if we increase the scope and we don't change the cost or the time, guess what's affected? Quality, okay? And I show you risk kind of on the bottom there. Really, it should be like a cloud sitting around everything. And it's like the cloud of uncertainty around scope, cost, and time, because there's uncertainty related with these, and even quality. Now, if I take some money off the project, let's say the project's a $100,000 project, and I say, hey, we're having some financial issues, I need to cut the budget for that project by 10%. The triple constraint says I need to do some adjustment to the schedule, which is time, or the scope. So probably de-scoping the project. Okay, now that's important to know as we move to the next slide. Okay, so if we look at, let's compare what that triple constraint looks like for traditional project management and Agile or adaptive project management. So in the traditional approach, we have a fixed scope, which means at the beginning of the project, we say, this is what this project is about. Here is the end result. Here are the features or the requirements, what we need, the product, service, or result. And that is defined up front, and it's fixed. Time and cost are estimated based on that fixed scope, okay? In Agile, we flip that around. So I literally show that in the visual, like flipping the triangle. So we flip it around and we say, our schedule's fixed and our cost is fixed. So we're saying, I have 6 months, and here's how many people I have. So I can tell you at the beginning of the project, we are going to be done in 6 months to that day, and I'm going to tell you exactly how much it's going to cost. What I can't tell you is what we're going to get done. And that may seem a little weird. I've actually had colleagues of mine, we've had many discussions about this. Well, how is a customer going to sign up for that? Especially, I do a lot of federal government work, and why would the federal government say, here's some time and here's some money, I'm going to give you money, but I don't know what I'm going to get at the end of 6 months? Well, there's good news, bad news about this. The good news is that the customer often doesn't know exactly what they need at the end of those 6 months, which is why you're using this agile approach, which is value driven. So that what I can tell you is that at the end of the 6 months, what you get will be most important to you, because I am going to be communicating with that customer and making sure I know the value and the priority of all of the scope that comes out as we work through the project. So the challenge is if I can't get a commitment on what the scope is from my customer, if they don't have it clearly defined, then I can't commit to a time and a cost. So why not then commit to the time period and the cost and allow the scope to be defined? So that's kind of how that looks and how it's a little bit different. So we consider this value driven because the scope and time are fixed, but the features are estimated. So with every increment, we're estimating how much work we're going to get done. And hopefully we're going to get better at doing that estimate, and we will be more accurate in saying what we're going to get done for each iteration that we have throughout the project. So next slide, please. Okay, so this gives you some references. You can go to the next slide. That's kind of there if you want to see that later. If anybody wants a PDF of this presentation, we get to the end, you can certainly email me. So next slide. I like to kind of give credit to people. Agile methodology. So those references were kind of to do with those types of things. So a little bit about this. There's a number of different Agile methodologies, like I shared with you before. And one of the things I found, one of my clients years ago said, I want to look at all the Agile methodologies and I want to know which one is best. Okay. And kind of looked at different things, shared different things with them. And I said, you know, answering that question, which is best, like there really isn't a best. It's kind of like saying, which is the best tool? Is it a knife or a fork? Well, it depends what I'm eating. And what about chopsticks? You know, I love sushi, and it always amazes me. I've been adept at being able to use chopsticks. I'm pretty good at using them. Chopsticks are the perfect way to eat sushi. And if you watch somebody try to eat sushi with a knife and a fork, it's painful to watch. It doesn't work right. That tool was not meant for that food. Just as odd as it would be to try to eat a hot dog with chopsticks, it's as odd to me to watch somebody use a knife and a fork to eat sushi. So there isn't a best tool, but there is a best tool for certain situations. So it depends on the culture of your organization. It depends on the environment, what kind of processes your organization has. You know, what's the culture of your organization? How do they react to things? How do they deal with things? Whatever your organization is like, if you implement Agile, what I find is you then see every way that your organization is not Agile. Okay, so instead of people think, oh, we're going to implement Agile, it's going to be wonderful. It will be eventually, but in the short term, like with any change, when you implement it, you're just going to notice all the ways that you're not that way, which is a bit challenging. Okay, so it's not that you shouldn't implement Agile, but you shouldn't do so just thinking, hey, it's going to fix everything. So yes, next slide, please.
One of the things which just kind of, you know, Marina was sharing.
Somebody needs to put themselves on mute. I can hear back. I don't know, T, if you're able to do mute everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I think you can hear me now. All right, so thank you for that, T. Okay, so what is Scrum? It was created in the 1990s by Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. It's an agile practice for project management. Scrum is one of the most common agile methodologies that's used, and work is done in generally 2 to 4 week iterations. You can do it in a 1 week iteration. It's just not very common. And there's a report called the version 1 report, annual report. The company's called version 1, and they come out with an annual report. And in that, they say that Scrum is the most common Agile method that's used. And if you're curious about that, another reason to email me at the end of the webinar, I can share that information with you on the version 1 report. So next slide. Okay, so the reason I included Scrum in here is because, believe it or not, Scrum is being used for non-IT projects. And Scrum, I think, is best shown in a picture. So, you know, they say a picture is 1,000 words. So in Scrum, we have this product backlog, which is our list of requirements. We have a sprint planning meeting. And this sprint planning meeting, we actually take this huge list of requirements and we break down and say, okay, here's the requirements that we're going to work on for this iteration, whether it's 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever the iteration length. And that's what we put in that sprint backlog. Then as we work through that sprint, every day we do a daily Scrum meeting. And in that meeting, we say, okay, oh, I'm sorry for the background noise. They're literally landscaping outside my window. Apologize for that. Not something I planned for. Yeah, sorry about that. It should go away in a second. So the daily Scrum, we're asking the questions, what have you done? Or what have I done? I'm answering the question, what have I done since the last meeting? So the last 24 hours. What do I plan to do in the next 24 hours? And what barriers or impediments are in my way? What's stopping me? Which actually really alludes to the risks, to the uncertainties. And so that's my daily Scrum. At the end of the sprint, so during the sprint, we're doing all this work. At the end of the sprint, we have a review meeting where we share that with the customer. We share what we've done, and we only share the things that we've completed, not the things that we're working on that are almost done. They have to be completed. And then we have the result. So it's potentially releasable product increment. That's what adds value. That's what gives value to our customer. Next slide, please. So who's who? The roles of Agile Scrum. We have the product owner. You know, Scrum is very simple. I was just talking to a colleague of mine about this the other day. It just has these 3 roles. We have the product owner, which I've mentioned. They're in charge of ensuring that value is delivered to the customer. Regardless of the industry, regardless of what you're working on, they're the person that represents the business, the end customer. Okay, and they are prioritizing those customer needs. Okay, very, very key important role. And what I was saying with my colleague just the other day is that this is probably one of the most important roles in Scrum. Most people think the Scrum Master is the most important role. And I would say the product owner is the most important role, because if we don't have a sense of the priority, we don't know what's valuable to the customer, then whatever we create is not necessarily going to be useful. And that's really primarily what we're focused on doing. The Scrum Master actually facilitates the Scrum method. They don't delegate to the team. They're not the project manager. And a lot of times people think, they think I'm going from being traditional to Agile, so as the project manager, I'm going to become a Scrum Master. Well, you certainly could take on that role, but you need to understand what that role entails. And the Scrum Master is not telling the team what to do. Instead, they own this method and they know the ins and outs of the method, and they make sure everybody's following the method. So they're kind of like the gatekeeper. I think of like the sergeant at arms. I don't know if you know Robert's Rules of Order, but they're just making sure everybody's following the process. But they're not telling people what to do. They're not delegating. They're not doing the things that the project manager does at all. Then we have the team member, and our team can be anywhere from 5 to 9 people. So it's usually, you see it as 7 plus or minus 2. The big thing is don't let the team be more than 10 people. There's actually some social psychology on that. But over 10 people, it changes the dynamics of the team, and basically if you had 12 people, you'd sort of end up with 2 groups of 6, just from a team dynamics perspective. And that's why we want to keep that team size down so that we're all working cohesively. The team members are responsible for contributing their skills to the team. And we usually have people that have some specific area of expertise, but then some also broad skills. So we don't necessarily want a bunch of individual subject matter experts. We want people who have an area that they're strong in, that they know deeply, but we also want them to have a broader knowledge at the same time. And that's a really interesting distinction for team members, because in traditional projects, we would have somebody who does QA and somebody else who does development and somebody who does documentation. And in Scrum teams, we really have people that do all of those things. So if you code, you also test. And if you test and you code, you also document. Minimal documentation, but you do document. Okay, and the team members are actually the ones who are completing the work for the project. The next slide, please. Scrum artifacts. So the Scrum artifacts are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, burn down charts or burn up charts, the task board, which is actually that Kanban board, one of the things I mentioned before, and definition of done. And you know, these I can provide more information with those in future training, but these are just to mention, these are some of the artifacts that are used to do this work. And one of the books that I show here actually is one of my favorite books on Scrum, other than the Scrum Guide itself, which is actually free. You can get it online, you can download it for free. It's called A Breathtakingly Brief and Agile Introduction, and it's a very small, very thin book. I originally got it Kindle version, and when I actually got the paper version, I was so amazed how small it is. So if you want a succinct book on Scrum, that is a great one. And if you don't want to spend money, but you want to know what Scrum entails, the Scrum Guide is written by Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber, who I call the fathers of Scrum. They basically created it, although they don't like to think of themselves that way. So I call them the fathers of Scrum. And that's another great resource to learn more about Agile Scrum. So next slide, please. Okay, and then this just reiterates that sprint cycle and what that looks like. All right, next slide. More references for you, and next slide. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the PMI-ACP certification, which is one of the courses that we teach here at PMO Advisory. So as an individual, why would you want to do this? Well, it gives you an edge on your career options, your salary, your job comprehension. I was just talking to a colleague of mine I've known for many years, and he was talking to me about what they're doing in his workplace and you know, what certification might be best for him. And one of the ones I mentioned to him was this certification. Part of the reason for that, he's actually doing architecture type of work, IT architecture work. And one of the reasons that I mentioned this certification is because he had been thinking about PMP certification for a while, but he doesn't really use traditional project management in the work that he does. But he realizes the value in having a certification that's from the Project Management Institute, because much of his organization, they do have PMP certifications. So even though that's not a focus for the work he does, he can see the value in having something from that certifying body that will be respected and appreciated by other people in his organization. PMI-ACP certification, what's interesting about this cert is that it highlights your subject matter expertise, but also your experience. So many of the Agile certs that exist are basically just taking a test and passing that test. With the ACP, you're also showing that you have experience in working in Agile projects. So to me, it's a more robust certification because of that. It carries a bit more weight. One of the stats that we have is the salary of a certified PMI-ACP person is 28% higher than a non-certified professional. So that's something very significant. And talking to my colleague, one of the things I asked him about is not just what's important to him in his current employment, but what might be valuable to him in the future. And so whenever you're looking at getting certifications, you want to look at that. What's valuable right now, and what's something that may be valuable for me in the future that may not even be valuable now, but is important for my professional development. PMI-ACP certification also increases your marketability to existing potential clients or employers. And it's a nice differentiator, because I noticed that a lot of people in the project management arena have a PMP. But if you have a PMP, getting a PMI-ACP can just be that extra thing that makes you a little bit different than other people. Shows that not only do you know a traditional approach, you know the Agile approach also. And keep in mind that if you don't have a PMP, you can still go for your PMI-ACP. So it does not require the PMP cert, but it certainly is a differentiator. It also demonstrates your commitment to professional development and ongoing education. And if you do have a PMP certification, you can actually use your training for PMI-ACP to obtain PDUs to maintain your PMP credential. I just saw a question from Patricia. Do I know how more challenging the ACP is than the PMP? I think it's less challenging. The reason being, it has a bit more narrower of a focus than the PMP. And also, if you just look at the education, it's 21 hours versus 35 hours. So it's definitely less content. So if you've passed your PMP, I'm confident you can pass your ACP, but it does require studying. It does require knowledge, but it is not as difficult in my experience. Okay, so next slide. All right, so from an organizational perspective, the PMI-ACP certification provides diversified methods of Agile, so not only Scrum. So a lot of the other Agile certs are just on Scrum. First of all, if you're not sure that your organization can use Scrum or wants to use Scrum, for example, Kanban, I use Kanban very often. And again, for non-IT projects, I use it for many projects that I work on. And the ACP is going to give you knowledge on these different methods. Also, most companies tend to use a blend of these methods or multiple ones at once. And a little bit more information there around projects. Organizations that are highly agile and responsive to market dynamics complete more of their projects successfully than slower moving counterparts. So 75% versus 56%. So next slide, please. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I'm going to go through some of these a little quicker. This is the experience that you need. You're going to need 2,000 hours of general project experience and 1,500 hours working on Agile project teams. And I believe that experience is based on a 4-year degree. If you do not have a 4-year degree, you'll need some more. And you can look in the PMI.org site for more information about that, or you can email me and I'll send it to you. And the education, again, is 21 hours. So next slide, please. Okay, and these are some of the free things that you can access from the PMI website. There's the ACP Credential Handbook. That actually just helps you fill out the application, the PMI-ACP application. And the exam content outline is also free on the PMI.org website. And it provides you with information on what is covered in the PMI-ACP certification. Next slide, please. And if you're a member, you can actually download the Agile Practice Guide, which is appended to the PMP, the PMBOK guide that's used for preparing for the PMP exam. So if you're a PMI member, you have access to the Agile Practice Guide automatically. These are some of the things that are covered on the PMI-ACP exam. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail because I want to leave us some time for questions. So go ahead, next slide. These are the domains and tasks that are covered on the exam, and they're also covered in the training. I've had some people attend the PMI-ACP training just to learn more about Agile. And at the end of that training, they decide, you know what, I do want to take the certification, but even just to take it to learn more so that you're more educated in your workplace and around people who are talking about Agile is a huge benefit. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to apply for the ACP certification. PMI.org, I'll give you the information that you need there. That's the the full link. But if you go to PMI.org and then click on certifications, PMI-ACP, it'll bring you to more information. Next slide, please. So why would you do the PMI-ACP? We talked about this before. This kind of just summarizes that. So next slide, please. So if you're interested in pursuing Agile, register for one of these classes that I teach. I teach an Agile fundamentals class. So if you're really new to things and you're not sure you want to learn everything nuts and bolts with ACP, but you want to get some basis of Agile understanding, it's a 4-hour class, and I'm teaching one in September and one in October. So it's a smaller time commitment, so that might be a good solution. And then the other class I teach is a live virtual class. We do it in 3 sessions, 4 hours each. We find that 4-hour mark really works well for people to not be overwhelmed by information, and just overwhelmed, especially to be in a virtual environment for 8 hours, can be very difficult. So we're finding that having it in 4-hour blocks works really well. I also find most of my students are really happy because they can kind of, you know, breathe a little bit between learning content, do some self-study, and then come back to class. And it's sort of an easier way to learn over a period of time than you know, 2 or 3 days in a row. So we really try to be efficient with your time. And that also entails each of these classes will give you practice questions, quizzes, and also content online. So you can do some self-study, and together that adds up to your 21 hours. So even though you're only spending 12 hours in class time, trying to schedule those 12 hours, you will meet all 21 hours. So more information about that, go to the PMO advisory site, or you can contact me directly. Next slide. So these are some live virtual classes for other content. So we have PMI-ACP I just mentioned to you. We also provide PMP classes, PGMP, which is the Program Management Professional, PFMP. We are one of the sole providers, or one of the few providers of PMFP. And in fact, anyone anywhere that asks me about PMFP, I send them to T. T knows more about portfolio management than any other professional I know. So definitely consider that if you're interested in portfolio management. And then the PMI-RMP, which I also teach that class, Risk Management Professional. So those are our classes that we have in the rest of this year. So next slide, please. So this tells you a little bit more about the ACP class and the different formats that we have. Next slide, please. And that brings us to questions. So I wanted to make sure we had at least a few minutes for questions. And if I can't get to your question now, you could certainly email me. This gives you a little information how to claim your PDU for this class, and how to go about doing that. And if you have questions, you can, I think, put them in the chat box is probably the best way to do it, just with the audio challenges. Any questions, anybody? Any questions on the certification exam? Any questions on the content? Anybody in an industry that I didn't mention that is kind of curious, well, how would I do this in my industry? What does an Agile project look like in my industry? Does anybody have that question? I recently wrote an article with a colleague of mine who was supporting one of her colleagues who's in the health industry, actually physical therapy. And she was using Agile practices basically to deal with things with the coronavirus, because they really had to pivot and shift things. Patricia asked if I can describe the boot camp versus the other course.
Why don't I jump in and
thank you, Chief.
Question? Sure. So Patricia and everybody else, so boot camps in our case are very, very targeted. In the case of the certification bootcamp, whether for PMI-ACP or PMP, the primary goal is getting you the information the concepts, the tools, the way to study in preparation for that examination. The courses have a lot of goals. They're more foundational, they're more conceptual, they're more about application and understanding. And the training or courses also deviates in such that it is not targeted to pass a particular. Of course, the course content can be very aligned between the camp and any of the courses, but those are the primary differences. Susan, I think there's another question from Cecilia. It's best for you.
Thank you, Cecilia. So do I prefer Agile over Scrum? Is Agile more efficient? Well, Scrum is one of the Agile methods. So I don't have a preference of one over the other. As far as the methods within Agile that I use, like I said, Scrum is the most widely used. I don't actually use Scrum as often as I use Kanban and other Agile practices, just because I do a lot of consulting work and I end up doing it sort of by myself. So I don't have a big team to work on things together. Some of my teams are smaller, like coordinated efforts, like one other person or two other people. So Scrum doesn't really align well with that. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but Scrum is Agile. It's one of the Agile methods, but there are also many other Agile methods. So I wouldn't necessarily prefer one to the other, but thank you for asking the question.
The way I'll look at it, I'll jump in with my answer.
Sure, absolutely.
If your or the company that you work for uses and really only Scrum, I think Scrum is a more suitable certification because but as Susan mentioned, there are many, many different Agile methods. If anything, I almost willing to bet one of the most common methods to form of hybrid, meaning the tradition and that of something else, whether it's Lean, Kanban, Scrum, or something else. As a matter of fact, we have interesting research out there to get a sense of what the various methodology people adopt. So what ACP gives you is a broader umbrella. It is not a particular methodology. It is more about a general set of philosophy. And that gives you enough understanding that if you are in a Scrum world or a Lean world or a Crystal world, you can quickly adopt that understanding, get applicable to that methodology. So it depends on what you're going after.
I support what you said there too. I wasn't looking at the question that way, but as far as certifications go, unless your organization is just using Scrum, I generally recommend the PMI-ACP because Scrum is just one part, it's one method of Agile. And so I agree with T that most organizations are using some type of hybrid. They're not using a pure Scrum implementation. Even my colleague yesterday I was talking to, he said, well, we have a Scrum Master, but we're not really doing Scrum. That is way more common than you would think. People doing what we call pure Scrum is just very uncommon. So I say, educate yourself on a lot more broader information, and then you can be in a better position given your organization and what they choose to do. I see Cami has a comment here.
Yes, let me just jump in since I actually changed the note with Cami on this. So there is no easy answer to the question, by the way. It depends a lot on the organization factors, your team factors. But one about sort of the intersection between the traditional waterfall and that of the Agile from a life cycle approach is that organizations ought to do some level of the traditional planning, initiation and planning. It is the execution phase or implementation phase that can be organized into shorter sprints such as Scrum or phases as more in tradition, and then putting closing aside for a second. So one way to address the question would be to fundamentally treat the projects and essentially the project that you're working on as two separate projects, create a hybrid. So from a pure development perspective, it may still be in the agile mode. A maintenance of the product, the portal, and the support and the planning, treat that as a more traditional. So in other words, you projects running concurrently, and to a third-party user, it could look like the same. By the way, that is the nature of the high. So what you still do is, if you have a lot of defects, and a lot of them has root cause issues, you could still do the traditional way. But if it happens to match the next release because you use some kind of agile, it's coming up, you may want to release the fix using the approach, the project management, as more release management. There are downsides because you're almost always going to play catch up because the release cycle may very well be faster than how fast you could fix things. But that is one of the downside because in retrospective, you're now trying to fit multiple methodology into the same problem. That way does work. And at some point, you can slow down the development. For example, mention that we got most of the feature implemented. So our release cycle go from, let's say, a month to 2 months, which is still suitable in the sprint. You have play time to catch up. So there are flexibilities to do this. Other questions? Oh, I see there's a couple. How does PMI-ACP cover Scrum? Well, remember, Scrum is a particular technology. ACP more broadly at a principle level, conceptual level. So the concepts in ACP generally to all the Agile methodology, that includes Scrum. Okay, Susan, I guess back to you.
Okay, I was just looking up, put in my email address there again.
So
the recording of the presentation, I think we will have that available.
Yep. So what I could do with the presentation, I think more and more people like to have the presentation. We could make that available at the time we use the recording. So typically about 4 days later, so let's say give till next Tuesday, we will put out the video, and in there will contain a link for the presentation, which you could then just download. And I'm going to put the address you all should visit. And that is our main address for the webinar anyway. So there you could see our past, present webinars.
So if anybody has any questions about Agile education, either fundamentals class or a PMI-ACP class, certainly let me know. Or even just things on the topic of how do I use Agile for non-IT projects. I could talk more about that with you specifically if you have some things you want to talk about. Again, I shared my email address there. More than happy to speak with you. And just a plug for PMO advisory. We do these webinars regularly, I think at least once a month, right, T?
Correct.
On various topics. So if you're interested, you can sign up on the site and you'll get notification when a new webinar is being scheduled. So sometimes we talk about Agile and we talk about many other topics. We also have a blog, which I write to regularly. I think I probably owe one recently. I do a lot on Agile, but there's many other topics there too, also very valuable. So yeah, stay connected with us and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you and further educate you. And we're not, T and I don't just teach about project management. We actually do it. We do consulting work. We're working regularly and using this every day. So we're happy to answer any questions. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. We're going to end the meeting now. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.